Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrive by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 196, we sit down with Richard Wines, author, historian, and preservationist, whose family's roots in Jamesport stretch back to the 1600s. Growing up on the North Fork, Richard developed a deep appreciation for the land, the community, and the stories that have shaped this place across generations. Over the years, he's dedicated himself to preserving that heritage, restoring historic buildings, researching the region's past, and working to protect the rural landscape that defines the North Fork's character. In our conversation, we talk about his experiences growing up in Jamesport, his family's long history in the North Fork, and how early religious and political movements influenced the development of the region we know today. We also discuss his recent book, A Farm Family on Long Island's North Fork, which traces centuries of local history through the lens of one family's enduring connection to the land. So I hope you enjoy episode 196 with Richard Wines. This episode was recorded June 20th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
Well, thank you for having me here.
Definitely. And just in the beginning, I usually like to start off if you can just give us a little background about yourself, where you were born and raised.
Sure. I was raised in the community of Northville, pretty much forgotten these days, but part of Riverhead Town. We really called the community Sound Avenue then, not Northville as much. It's the only community named after a road. It's even incorporated and had that name once. So I grew up in Northville. I went to the Northville Elementary School, which meant I was always in a class with at least one other class and sometimes two other classes in the same room. And then in 8th grade, I moved to the Riverhead High School building. So I'm a Riverhead High School graduate.
Wonderful. And then now in terms of your family's history and ancestry out here, it's been connected to the land in Jamesport since the 1800s. Can you share a bit about your family's history in the region?
Well, I have a lot of ancestors that were amongst the first settlers in Southold, including the Wines family, the Youngs family, the Budd family, Wells, and you could go on naming a bunch of others. It just happens that the property we live on has belonged to ancestors of mine since 1661, when the town of Southold divided up their common land in that area. It was given to John Budd, who left it to one of his daughters who married into the Youngs family. And then a member of the Youngs family married my great-grandfather, and it passed down to me, basically. But it was 1,000 acres back in 1661. We only have 15 acres left, and it's kind of bounced around in the family in odd ways. I had to buy out 2 uncles. My grandfather had to buy out his aunts. So it sort of bounced around, but it has been in the family but we only have this tiny little bit left. But one thing I always like to say is, even though my family has been here on the North Fork since the 1600s, in some ways, that just means they didn't have any gumption. All the people who had big ideas and more ambitions, they mostly left. So maybe we could say that my family or my ancestors are the ones that had less ambition and less gumption to go out and explore the rest of the world and make a bigger name for themselves.
But what did some of your ancestors do work-wise?
Well, most of them were farmers.
Farmers.
I mean, my brother is still a farmer. And that was the main business here on the North Fork, certainly until fairly recently.
Mm-hmm.
My paternal line, ironically, my great-great-great-grandfather, I guess it was brought up in Mattituck. The Rulin farm there was actually a Wines family farm that a distant ancestor bought in the late 1600s, and the Rulons were also wine's descendants. But my great, I think it's 3G's grandfather, left there and went to New York City and became a carpenter in New York City. And then his son ended up living in what's Harlem today, and his grandson ended up living in Westchester, where my father was born, in Mount Vernon. But they still had connections here. And so my great-grandfather, who was living in Westchester at the time, came out to visit cousins and went to the camp meeting in Jamesport. This was the Methodist camp meeting that was quite famous, and met a local girl, a member of the Youngs family. And so he ended up marrying her. And that's how, even though my family had this little detour through New York City and Westchester, ended up back out here. And then they ended up, my grandfather inherited the property and ended up building a summer bungalow in Jamesport to take advantage of this little bit of land that they owned. And my mother's parents bought the tiny little plot next door. We're talking 50-foot wide plots. They were farmers in Northville and built a summer bungalow there. And my parents met across the fence. So my Wines family ended up this little detour through New York City in the pre-Civil War period in Westchester, and then coming back to Long Island. And my father moved back here after marrying my mother.
And did you get to meet any of your grandparents?
Oh, yeah.
Both sides?
My father's father was certainly still alive, and I spent a lot of time with him. He didn't die until I was in college. And my mother's parents, my grandfather on that side, had a mental breakdown during the Depression from hard. He was a farmer, of course, and this was not uncommon, and ended up in the Kings Park Mental Institution for the rest of his life. So I didn't know him very well, but I knew my grandmother very well. She lived just down the street from us, and spent a lot of time with her, heard a lot of stories. And of course, it was the Sound Avenue community was this big extended family, basically. They had great uncles and cousins, and all of them were farmers, and there were big family parties sometimes, Christmas parties, Thanksgiving parties, beach parties. Several family members had summer cottages or places on either the Sound or the Bay. We had one on the Bay, of course. So it was an interesting little community. When I say but it was a community within the community, because the Sound Avenue community also was at least half Polish in its immigration. We were all together in school, but otherwise it was quite separate in many ways.
And were there any other interesting stories that stood out to you that your grandparents told about growing up out here, or the community out here, that you can think of?
I'm sure I'll come back to some as we're talking.
Okay. And then, so did you mentioned on your dad's side they went into the city, or did he grow up out here though?
He actually grew up in Westchester.
He grew up in Westchester,
but he was summering out here.
Oh, okay.
Because my grandfather had this summer cottage he'd built in the 1920s.
Oh, okay. And you said how your parents met, and did your mom go to school out here though?
Yeah, she went to the same elementary school I went to, and same high school, and then she went and studied home economics at Cornell.
Wow. And what did your parents end up doing for a living?
My father was a bookkeeper, but he died when I was quite young. I think I was in second grade. And my mother, well, she was a 4-H agent for a while, and mostly when I was growing up, she worked as a waitress in the Modern Snack Bar in Accabogue.
Oh, wow.
Which is literally a town landmark now, because as chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, we made that sign an official town landmark a few years back.
And how long has the snack bar been there?
Oh, It was started around 1948, 49, something like that. And the Whitmire family acquired it not too long afterwards, and they're still running it.
And did you have any siblings?
I have two siblings, and they both never left Long Island, basically, unlike me. And one of them lives next door to me. He was an auto mechanic by profession. And the other one farms on what was my grandparents' farm on Sound Avenue. And he was a potato farmer for many years. And then about 10 years, 15 years ago, his son, my nephew, who lives with him, converted the farm so it's primarily a raw milk dairy now. Although my brother still has about 1,000 chickens and also sells vegetables and anything else he can grow on the farm.
And then in terms of for you growing up out here, how would you describe it as a child, and what activities would you do outside of?
Well, growing up in, I think, any rural community is very different from the way people grow up today. I mean, you're pretty much on your own, but you're free. You can wander, you can go visit friends, you can, but I also grew up working. My father died when I was quite young, so we had to take care of the yard, we had to take care of the gardens, and then I started working for other farmers, mostly relatives, when I was 12, 13, something like that. Probably wasn't quite legal. But in fact, I remember I was not strong enough to lift a full bag of potatoes onto the truck. So when we were digging potatoes, we had to load the bags a little bit lighter so I could get them up there. But so I really grew up working. I also took care of a cemetery, the Sound Avenue Cemetery. I worked, when I was in high school, I worked 60 hours a week for a farmer. And then in my spare time, I mowed the cemetery.
Okay.
But it also meant I had zero interest in sports. Still do.
Yes.
I mean, I love doing things, but watching other people play.
Yeah. But, and then was it mostly for the farming aspect? Was it all potatoes at that time?
Well, the farms I worked on were typical Long Island farms at the time, which meant they were like 80% potatoes, but we also grew cauliflower and cabbage and strawberries and maybe a few other things. Typically there might be a cow, a little hay.
Yeah.
But potatoes, it was a potato monoculture then. Mm-hmm. We could look out the back door of the house, and we grew up in an old farmhouse. You could look out the back door, and as far as you could see in every direction, it was potatoes to the horizon, basically. I have an exhibit now at the Halligan Museum about that, all about the potatoes and Long Island. One part of the exhibit is actually my grandparents' experience. I found my grandmother's. She had a tiny little diary, but she'd written down each year how much they sold their potatoes for, and sometimes there'd be a comment, didn't make expenses or things like this. Well, then my training as an historian, I'm very interested in quantitative history, so I started doing the math and figuring out how much it costs to grow those potatoes, and I turned it into a chart. And of course, the break-even line is down the middle, and you can see the years they were above and the years they were below, and you can follow it along. And potato farming was not an easy thing to do because, as my great-uncle said, one of the people I worked for, most years you didn't make any money or much money. Typically, there'd be 3 or 4 years that were really bad. There'd be maybe half a dozen years that were middling. And then there'd be 1 or 2 years that were really good. And you'd have a blowout year. This tended to be, sometimes it happened because the transportation system in New England broke down and they couldn't bring potatoes down from Maine, so the price would go way up. But it was very much a connection between the price of potatoes, which is determined by factors that farmers had no control over, and weather, which also was something farmers had no control over. There could be years when they got 50 bushels an acre, and there could be years when they got 350 bushels an acre. And needless to say, you didn't make much money at 50 bushels an acre, regardless of what the price was. But every once in a while, that would come together, and it was actually quite a prosperous farming community from the Civil War time up through the 1920s, probably. And to some degree thereafter. Sound Avenue was lined with big farmhouses, for instance, and visitors commented on this in that time frame. But this chart I put together, you see it going up and down and below, and then in Depression, of course, it's below the line, and then you get this little gap where my grandfather had this mental breakdown and went into the mental institution. And then my uncle wasn't old enough to start farming then, but as soon as he was like 17, he took over the farm. And you see, during World War II, there were some good years, of course, because the government supported the price. And then the thing crashed after the war. Then there was this one really blowout year. I think it was like 1950. My uncle brought his bright new red truck. And then the price went down and down and down. And after losing money for several years, my uncle gave up farming in 1956. But as you can watch his trajectory of...
Yes. But even with that was your grandfather during the Great Depression, do you think that was related to the collapse in potato farming at that time in the 30s, or just a wide range of...
Oh, it was. He worked himself to a mental breakdown, basically trying to make a go on the farm, and the only way to do that was to work harder and harder. And I mean, the price was nothing, and there was some difficult weather years in there. And the same thing happened with another farmer in the community, one of the Polish immigrant farmers. And I've been doing a lot of research on the Polish farmers in the community too. We have exhibits on that at the Halleck Food Museum.
When did you notice the Polish population coming out here?
Well, it started in the 1880s. It really grew in the 1890s and the first couple of decades of the 20th century. There were large numbers of Polish immigrants. Most of them came as farm laborers, but within a few years they were hardworking. And within a few years, for instance, in the neighborhood of Halleckville, 70% of the farms belonged to Polish immigrants by 1930, which is pretty amazing. And after, as I've told you, I've done a lot of research on that particular history too, because it's a great immigrant story. One of our exhibits at the museum, I follow the Trubish family. And we have a picture of the boat he came over on in like 19, I can't remember the exact year, but around 1908 or so. And then he worked on a couple of farms and then was able to buy one of the Halleck farms. Actually, the Hallecks that lived in the homestead took a shine to this ambitious young man who seemed to be very hardworking and sold him the farm next door. And he was able to pay off, there were some good years there in 1919, 1920, right after World War I, and he was able to pay off his mortgage in like 2 or 3 years, something like that. But he also was one of the ones that had this mental breakdown. But following the history of that family, through the generations, and 2 generations later, one of his grandsons was the CEO of a major utility. So you got this immigrant and looking at these immigrants, they came with nothing. They came not because they were desperate. They came because they were being drafted into the Tsarist army. But they also came with some knowledge. And I remember interviewing a woman who'd come to this country as a displaced person after World War II in Riverhead from Poland. And she come to Riverhead, of course, because she had these relatives here. I'm not sure they really wanted to see her, but so I asked her, well, what was the main crop in the part of Poland that you came from? And she said, oh, potatoes, of course. So they came with it in their blood, basically. And they've been the Polish community has been a huge factor in the culture and here on the east end of Long Island ever since. You look at the number of descendants that are now leading citizens and town supervisors and you name it. But but it was exactly the same as immigration today. And this is what history is for me. This is why history is important, because you want to look at it and okay, what can we learn from that? What are the lessons from that? What are the parallels? And the parallels are never exactly the same. But you have these people that came with nothing. They weren't particularly welcomed. No, they were welcomed in one sense because farmers were desperate for labor. Mm-hmm. And this was a good source of cheap labor, and yes. In that time period, because the only way you could expand your farming operation is if you had more people to help. And so immigration was very important, just as it is today, by the way, providing labor that supports the economy. But they came with nothing. They didn't speak much English. Some of them never spoke much English, even after they'd been here for a while. They were Catholic, of course, and my family were all Protestants, all members of the same church. But what they did and the way they became Americans, and they in some ways became more American than anyone else. And so it's this way that immigrants and immigration and mixture of cultures, but new people coming in have been so important for both the North Fork and the country as a whole. And we owe much of what we are as a country to the fact that we've had this continuous fertilization. Yeah. That's why I like being married from a girl from Wisconsin. That's cross-fertilization, too, in another way.
Yes, yes, definitely. And then I was just curious, did you notice even, I guess it was when you were a child, some of the slowing decline of the potato as a crop out here?
Oh, of course. I watched most of my uncles and other relatives gave up farming in the 1950s or early 60s. My brother was unusual because, clearly by that point, my uncle was not farming. My father obviously wasn't there at all. He did try growing corn one year. It was a disaster. He barely made as much as the cost of his seed, apparently. Oh. But the family gradually gave up farming until I have, I think one second cousin that's still farming now. And my brother decided he wanted to get into farming. He loved farming. And so he went to Cobleskill and got an agriculture education there, and then came back and started renting a couple of farms and ultimately took over the farm that my grandmother owned. And that's where he lives now and has been farming ever since.
Yes.
But potatoes, back then, potatoes were a good commercial crop. Mm-hmm. There was a market for them. There was infrastructure for them. But competition from elsewhere in the country, especially out west, drove the price down. They could be probably a little more efficient. Land was a hell of a lot cheaper there. And even internationally, there's more competition for growing potatoes. We're not shipping them to the Caribbean anymore and things like that. So the markets changed, and Long Island was not well positioned to compete in all of that.
And what about duck farming?
Okay.
Out here.
The same thing happened to that in a way. And interestingly, the one remaining duck farm, the Corwin duck farm, Crescent farm in Accobock, they're actually descendants of the Halleck family in the homestead at the Halleck Museum, where I'm past president and current board member. One of the Halleck daughters married into the Corwin family. People always married in the neighborhood, basically, then. Mm-hmm. But the Corwin that she married was a carpenter. And their business was, they owned this land in Accobock. It was kind of sandy, not very good soil. So they'd gone into carpentry. And they were really more contractors when they were building churches and big buildings. So there's not a whole lot of demand in any one community to build too many churches. So they were working all over the island. Mm-hmm. And the Halleck that he married became ill, and so he wanted to have something he could stay home, and so he took up duck farming, so he could take care of his wife, basically. Unfortunately, she didn't survive too many more years, but the duck farm has. although with some major vicissitudes lately.
Yes.
But duck farmers as a whole, I mean, Doug is great because he's really specialized and he's bred his own ducks and has a national market. In fact, one of my daughters is the finance director for the Grand Teton Lodge Company in Grand Teton National Park, and their lodge uses ducks from Crescent Duck Farm.
Wow.
But many of them were, of course, driven out of business by environmental things because the way the ducks were grown was not terribly environmentally sound, although it always is ironic to me that everyone complained about all the pollution from the duck farms, and now we've gotten rid of all but one of them, and that one has major environmental. They've invested a whole lot in making sure there's no pollution gets out of it. But if anything, the bays were much healthier when all those duck farms were there than it is now, when all the duck farms are gone.
Why is that?
Well, of course, because a lot of them were replaced with houses.
Yes. So whatever runoff coming from the houses and
it's probably much worse. Yes,
the pesticides and all that.
Well, I mean, people use all this pesticides in their lawns. It's crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And why would you put fertilizer and pesticides on a lawn? It just makes it grow, and you have to mow it.
Yes. Yes. No, but and then for you grew up in, you said Northville?
Northville, that was the name of the community, although we always referred to it as Sound Avenue. It was the Sound Avenue Church, it was the Sound Avenue Grange,
Okay.
but the community was a little bit schizophrenic about its name because there's a Northville upstate, and so they could never use that as a post office address or whatever. When they had a post office, they called it Success, for instance. That was back in the 1880s and 90s. Said something about how well the farms are doing, but.
But how? Because I wouldn't know exactly, but or even for our audience, where is that in relation to Jamesport? Is that
the Sound Avenue community or Northville? It's basically the northeast corner of Riverhead Town.
Okay.
Jamesport is the southeast corner.
Okay.
And although the names have gotten confusing, names have always been fungible. But in Riverhead, a lot of these names have changed over time. And what's now Jamesport was originally Acklebog, and then it divided into Lower and Upper Acklebog. And so what's now Jamesport was Lower Acklebog until the 1830s, when a distant uncle of mine had this crazy idea of founding a whaling port. His name was James Tuttle. He named it after himself. He was inspired by Greenport, by the way, and wanted Jamesport to be like Greenport. He laid out the same kind of grid of streets, 600 building lots, for instance, and started selling them off. It was a speculative boom. He got a whaling ship to come into Jamesport. He founded a whaling company. Nancy and I actually live in the house that the whaling captain built.
Wow.
But it didn't make too much sense as a whaling port because it took 2 days for the whaling ship to get from Greenport to Jamesport.
Oh.
So it was kind of, and it's fairly shallow port too. I don't know how they ever got the boat in there, probably only at high tide. But he built a wharf and all kinds of other things. And James Tuttle was quite successful for a few years until he went bankrupt, which happened to most speculators. But so then the name became Jamesport, but that was the port. And then when the railroad came through, the train station took the Jamesport name. Well, then the post office took the Jamesport name. And then what's now, and then what was Lower Acklebog became Jamesport.
What's South Jamesport?
And then just after 1900, when the people down in the original port wanted to have their own post office, they had to go with South Jamesport.
Oh, okay.
So that became South Jamesport. And then in the 20th century, in Northville, a big tank farm was set up, and that was originally called the Northville Dock Company. And so realtors didn't like selling property with the Northville name. because we got associated with the Northville Dock Company with his tank farm and all this petroleum and everything. So they started calling that area Jamesport too. So now you see, so the town of Riverhead has never officially defined its hamlets because they've moved around, the boundaries have moved, the names have changed. Realtors have different ideas from people that grew up there, and there are not many people in Northville that grew up there anymore, so people don't use that name much anymore. Although,
yeah, because I haven't heard it.
Right, no, but if you look on a map,
Yes.
and there it is, Northville, and you look at, there's the road leading to it is Northville Turnpike.
Yes.
So, but as I said, it's a name that's not used much anymore.
Mm-hmm. But also, as a child, you mentioned some of the activities you would do, but would you go into Riverhead as a child on weekends, and would you hang out or go to the theater or...
Are you kidding?
On Main Street?
Hang out? I mean, Northville had well, there was one tiny little convenience store. I think I went to it once in my life or something.
Yeah.
It was next to the school, but my mother wouldn't let me go. And so Riverhead was where we had to go to do shopping, of course. And I guess I went to the movies 2 or 3 times, but not much.
Okay.
Not much.
What was it at that time? How was the downtown?
Oh, downtown was quite vibrant then.
Oh, okay.
It was the boom in downtown. They were building new stores, bigger stores. The ones that are all white elephants now were mostly built in the 1950s.
And I think people would probably talk about it, about where all the shopping is on that north road there.
Route 58.
Route 58
Right.
was all open farm.
The Route 58 was a relatively new road at that point.
Yeah.
And it had been cut. It was designed to be a shortcut so that people driving from the North Fork to New York City didn't have to go through all the traffic and congestion of downtown Riverhead, because Route 25 makes that loop into downtown Riverhead. So Route 58 was a shortcut, and certainly in 1950 there was hardly anything on it.
And that's obviously developed over time.
Right. The hospital came. I mean, I was born in Greenport because there was no hospital in Riverhead.
So you had to come out to Greenport.
Well, my mother did.
Yeah. Oh, and then I was curious, would you come out even in through middle school, high school? Would you come out to Greenport at all, or would you stay more in the Riverhead area?
Oh, almost never came out here.
There wasn't any real need to.
There was no need to. I mean, we didn't really leave our community very much. Most of what we did was I was in the 4-H club and things like that. I was obviously involved in school activities in high school, but we went to the ocean once or twice a year.
Yes.
But mostly we stayed in the community. In summers, we went down to my grandfather's cottage on the bay, which where we live now.
Yes. Even going through high school, how was it going to Riverhead High School at that time? And were you interested in history at that time?
I was. I wrote the first history of Northville when I was in 7th grade.
Oh, wow.
So I was interested in history at a very early age, and it was one of my favorite subjects in high school. I had some very good teachers, including Thomas O'Neill, who died here in Southold, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. Was one of my favorite. He was my U.S. history teacher in high school, and certainly piqued my interest in that. But I got a very good education in Riverhead High School. It sent me to Yale, so I can't complain about it.
Did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
I knew I wanted to go in the Peace Corps. And I'd always loved teaching. I was interested in teaching, but no, I didn't have any clear ideas.
What did you end up studying at Yale?
At Yale, I kind of toyed between history and political science and ended up as a political science major, but that's pretty closely related to history in many ways.
And were you interested, because some people even today might say I want to move away from the North Fork. Did you want to at that time, and were you interested in coming back to the North Fork later?
Well, from Yale, I did what I'd always wanted to do. I went into the Peace Corps, went to India. And when I came back from India, I went to Harvard and got a MAT degree, and lived in Boston for 10 years with my first wife. And no, I never thought I'd be coming back to the North Fork. It was somewhat by accident. After our marriage broke up, I ended up working in New York City and met Nancy. We both went through the same program at NYU designed to sort of retread liberal arts PhDs for the business world. And we both ended up working on Wall Street. But we lived in Westchester. But we had this family summer cottage out here, which was it's actually the one my mother's family owned. The one my father's family owned is right next door. Is no longer in the family. So we came out here weekends, and Nancy loved it out here. She's a gardener at heart and loved gardening. And Long Island, the North Fork, is the most wonderful place to garden. We have the greatest soils. Where we live, we have no rocks. It's this wonderful, friable loam that just about anything grows. And so it's a beautiful place to garden. So she loved the gardening, and she's a sailor at heart, so she loved sailing. She'd grown up sailing on Lake Winnebago, so you had to learn how to do it in salt water, which is a little bit different. The waves are different. But so we were coming out weekends to this cottage, and one winter, this is I think 95, we subscribed to the News Review and had it delivered in Hastings. And we opened up the News Review, and there was this article about this house being torn down in Laurel. And we looked at it and said, oh, that was our favorite house in the whole community. We'd never been in it, but it looked interesting. And as I told you earlier, we later discovered it was built by the captain of the one whaling ship that came into. So it's a little different from the other. It looks very much like a lot of the houses in Greenport, because Wilbur had traveled to Greenport and he traveled the world, of course, as a whaling captain, and there are a lot of duplicates of it in Southampton and Sag Harbor, for instance, in New London. But it was a little different from the typical farmhouse in what's now Riverhead. So we saw this article with this house being torn down, and we said, they can't do that. So the next day, from the article, I figured out who it belonged to. And it belonged to Half Hollow Nursery. So the next day from my office on Wall Street, I called up, tried to call him up, and I couldn't get through his secretary. He wouldn't talk to me. His people were giving me a lot of grief about tearing this house down, because it was an historic house after all, and he didn't want anyone else giving him any more grief. So then I sat down the next day, and back then you did this by fax, but I wrote my best letter, explained to him that we owned property because I'd been buying out Nancy and I had actually, together, we've been buying out my uncles to get control of this 15 acres in Jamesport that had been in my family for so long. So we'd done that. We had already moved an old schoolhouse to our property, because we thought we needed to have a building on it, because we only bought the farmland initially. There were no buildings on the part we bought. The little cottage is an adjacent piece. So we bought this old schoolhouse and moved it there. My grandmother had actually gone to school in it.
Wow.
So there was a family connection, but that was mostly designed as decoration, a way to decorate our field. But so I wrote this letter explaining to him that we owned property, we had experience moving buildings, we'd love to move it and restore it. So I typed it up, faxed it to him, called his assistant again, and to my surprise, he was willing to talk to me that day. And I was going to make an offer for it, but he was so delighted that somebody wanted to take it that he gave it to us for free. But beware of free houses.
Yes.
We had an architect involved to make it legal for the restoration work, and he said, why don't we just make measured drawings and we'll reproduce it for you. It'll be a lot cheaper. And of course he was right. But it's not the same as living in an old house. Wouldn't have had the same kind of airflow in the winter that we have now, and not being able to get our dining room above 55 sometimes. But so that's how we ended up moving that house there. I'm not sure if it actually answered the question you started out with, but
no, I think. But in between that time from Yale, Harvard, and working in New York, did you always come back out and visit the North Fork?
Well, we had the summer cottage.
Okay.
So we were coming out summers, and of course, I had family here.
Yeah.
My two brothers were here, and initially there were some other cousins around. So I was always coming back, and Westchester isn't that far away. It's a 2-hour drive, but it was very much by chance. We'd never planned on coming back here permanently. So we had this house. And then, what are we going to do with it? Well, I guess we have to live in it. So 5 years. So initially, it was like a Potemkin village. We painted the outside and planted a garden in front of it because that's what we did as gardens, and it sat there as an empty shell. The inside had been basically demolished. They saved the good stuff, and then when we realized we might be able to retire and move out here, then we restored it and added on to it and made it livable again.
Yes.
But so it was almost by accident that we ended up back out here.
And was there always because I think looking back at your ancestry, particularly like Zachariah Hollick, shaped some approach to preserving the buildings and land associated with your family. Do you feel like when you came back out here, you had some responsibility to help preserve some buildings as well?
I guess that might be a little bit of it, but I don't. I'm not really much interested in genealogy. I think you have to take your family history pretty lightly. It doesn't give you any particular prestige. I'm always laugh at there are all these family histories that were put together in the 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930 time period, and they're all kind of full of themselves, how important their families are, and like they're royalty or something. And when I began looking into it, for instance, the first Halleck, the first Halleck is supposedly came here, according to the genealogy, is Peter Halleck, but there's not a shred of evidence he actually came. It's only oral history, and so. But his son definitely was here, William Halleck, and settled in Southold, and then got one of the divisions in the Ackelborg division in 1661 and built a house. It's actually very near where the Harbs farm stand is now. There's a little lane there called Halleck Lane, and he built a house down that lane in the 1670s. And the Halleck family have been there for generations thereafter, including leading to the Halleck Free Museum just down the street. But when I started looking into it, I started finding these deeds he'd signed, and he couldn't write his name. All he could manage was an H. He was illiterate. And so basically, he was, and he certainly wasn't at the top of the social ladder because Puritans really valued literacy. And as you know, the early settlers here were all Puritans. And about 70% of the Puritans in New England were literate, and he was not. So what we have is this impoverished, illiterate immigrant coming to this country. So it's the same stories. Even the Polish immigrants were literate in Polish, yes. but they weren't special people. They were normal people, yes. As I think, and I don't think to put very much pride in ancestry. I don't really think it's appropriate. I'm just as interested in the Polish ancestry, or I've been doing, as you know, a lot of research in slavery and black families and people of color and what happened to them, and all of these stories are interesting, and many of them tell the same message.
Yes, there's always like a connection.
And so, being one of the old families, I suppose, yeah, it's sort of an honor. But I think it's an honor we should take very lightly, and there was nothing special about that group.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Puritans were enslavers. They were pretty nasty to the first people that were here before them, for instance.
Yes.
Amy, my friend Amy Folk, has just written about what happened there, and really good research. But they. Even the Hallecks, William Halleck had 4 sons. One of them was a Quaker, and so he basically got driven out of town for his beliefs and disinherited by his father, because so they weren't in favor of freedom of religion either. And they may have been God-fearing in some ways, but a lot of the stories aren't very pretty.
Yes.
And it's important to, as a trained historian, in the work I do, I want to look at it, and even though I have some special access, having lived here and having family here, it gives me a knowledge about and information and so forth, but it can't be hagiography, and you have to look at. I mean, mostly what you're looking for is stuff that no one wanted to write about. That
was kind of put aside.
Right, it was put aside or whatever.
It's like we're going to focus on.
Right. I mean, there are slavery research. I mean, there were probably, my latest statistical analysis indicates there were about 900 enslaved people that lived on the North Fork from the founding of Southold and very shortly thereafter to the abolition of slavery in the state of New York in 1827. And as we started looking, I'm sure Amy told you this, Steve Wick came to us and said, can you give us any names? And we each came up with a couple of dozen maybe. But now we have like 450. But they were there in plain sight. But they're not indexed in any of the histories. For instance, church records are published often, like the Mattituck church records are published in Craven's History of Mattituck. And everyone else is indexed except for the enslaved people. They're mentioned. They're there in the church records because they got baptized or married or buried or something like this. But other than that,
was that the only way you were able to find their names?
Well, a lot of, church records were clearly very important. Census records never showed the names of enslaved people. Although there was a tally in Southold in 1698, I think it was, that did actually list the first names of the enslaved people in Southold at the time. But sometimes they show up in wills. I leave my wench Gina to my wife, along with my 2 cows and my riding chaise, and that kind of thing.
Yes.
So and sometimes they show up in store records, or a lot of different. They show up in a lot of different places, but it was not the focus of any of the earlier historians, which were much more interested in making their ancestors sound good.
Yes, but also just looking at your property, you've have a wide range of historic buildings on your property now. What first sparked this interest for you in preserving these buildings, and why was it important to you?
Well, we've talked about my interest in history and local history. When we first bought out, Nancy and I scraped up, and we basically saved all our extra pennies from our jobs on Wall Street and started buying out bit by bit. I think we did 3 different transactions to control the whole property, because my mother owned a little bit of it, but then these 2 uncles owned most of it. And we had to, and you know what it costs to buy real estate out here.
Yes. And
we had this idea of, wouldn't it be nice to have a building on it? Because what we'd acquired was all empty. We had this little cottage over in the corner that my grandfather had built in 1922, I believe it was. But other than that, and that's just a very simple little bungalow on locust posts. So that's how we got the schoolhouse. And I've told you how we ended up with a house. And then we thought, we need a barn. So we found a barn, and the house came with another little outbuilding, which they also threw in for no extra cost. And the last building we acquired was actually the outhouse for the school. So what we've created, in a sense, was we've preserved count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 historic structures. From all of them moved. All of them moved to the property. Some of them had family connections. Some of them didn't. But in essence, we've created a little enclave that looks a little bit like what Long Island always looked like. And Wynn's Way that goes past our house is this little dirt road. The house is originally on Main Road, or King's Highway, or whatever you want to call it, and it was probably a dirt road when the house was built. Yeah. Obviously, we both feel strongly about historic preservation. Nancy is also a trained historian, by the way. Yes. Her specialty was women's history, and so we like old things. Part of it's, what can I say? There may not be a whole lot of logic to it. I can give you all kinds of reasons why history is important, as can most historians, but it's also sometimes hard to describe. But historic buildings give a community character, and they give a community memory. They give you community connections to the past, and connections to the past often come with lessons. They come with depth. They can help make a place special. Greenport certainly has that. Southold has it. Riverhead has it. The histories are different in those different places. But seeing the way houses were built then, it's all hand craftsmanship, basically. It's an artistry of a different kind. They often tend to be beautiful.
You're not going to get the same quality, I feel like, today, unless you...
Well, today it's industrial.
Mass-produced.
Mass-produced, artificial materials. Styles, back then, styles were very local. Mm-hmm. Our house is a side hall house, which are many houses here in Greenport and all over the North Fork. That was a style that was common here on Long Island, on the east end of Long Island, and basically no place else in the country. Mm-hmm. In New England, all the old houses are center hall houses with 2 windows on each side and a doorway in the center. And here, how many houses do you see that's 2 windows and a door on the side, and the hall on the side? And that was kind of the generic house. It was built in every style imaginable. Ours happens to be Greek Revival, but others were Federal or even more vernacular than that before that, and later they became Victorian. All kinds of different things. But even in the Greek Revival, there's a lesson in that, because the reason they took up Greek Revival, they didn't call it Greek Revival then, they just emulated things Greek, because it was the early Republic, and they were emulating the Greek Republic. And so then they started building houses. The fancy ones here in Greenport sometimes have columns on them. Yeah. A little bit more like a Greek temple. Our house is much simpler Greek Revival. But our columns are pilasters, except on the fireplace there's a couple of columns, for instance. But there was that connection with American history and the creation of the Republic that shows up there in the architecture.
But were some of these properties... were they going to be destroyed, or did you just happen to have the opportunity to purchase them?
Well, I told you our house is being demolished. The schoolhouse, who knows what would have happened to it. It was in very bad shape. It was on a farm that actually my grandfather had bought. One of my great-grandparents had bought the schoolhouse because it was across the street from his house, and he used it for housing his help. And the first help was Polish. So Polish families lived in it, and then African-American families lived in it. Actually, if you're aware of Garfield Langhorne, Riverhead's one Medal of Honor winner in the Vietnam War. But he grew up in our schoolhouse. But after that, it was used to store hay, and it was basically falling apart. A tree had fallen through the roof on one side. They'd taken off the siding and nailed it over the windows to protect the hay that was inside. So it was in very bad shape and probably would have been demolished. Who knows what would have happened to it. But we basically saved it from demolition.
And then we're eventually restoring them all.
We've restored them, yes. I joke about it. Maybe it was a midlife crisis that made us do something crazy like that. But I don't know. How can I explain why we decided to restore these old buildings? But and we did. In the schoolhouse, we had a professional house mover, obviously, to to deliver the buildings.
Yes.
And we engaged various professionals to do some of the masonry work and major carpentry work. But Nancy and I did a lot of the restoration work ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we've always been very hands-on, and we're still very hands-on. Yes. We still do all of our own gardening. We still do all of our own painting, all of our own maintenance. And even though we own 7 old buildings, it's pretty crazy to do what we're doing. And I'm turned 79 next week. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to do these things, but Nancy's told me after I'm 80, I shouldn't be climbing ladders up to the 3rd floor.
But you've also hosted community events?
Oh, we do. The whole... If you preserve an old building, first of all, it's important to share it. And as you know, I'm also very involved in the Jamesport Meeting House, which we also, basically, Nancy and I were also instrumental in preserving that. We led the group that came together. That was on the market as commercial real estate, but it's actually the oldest public building on the east end of Long Island. It's older than any public building in Southold. It's older than any public building in Southampton. It's within a year or two of being the oldest public building any place on Long Island. There are houses that are older, but no churches, schools, or anything like that dates back to 1731. It was built the year that George Washington was in utero. That's the way I describe it. But it was on the market as commercial real estate. The church that was there was going out of business. And so we organized a community group to, we didn't have any money, and we had to negotiate with the minister in that church, and she didn't want to sell it to us because we didn't have any money. But we had to borrow all the money, basically. Which we did. We borrowed like 110% of what we needed to buy the building because we needed to do some renovation work, and bought it. But there's no reason to buy and preserve an old building like that unless you're going to use it. And so now we've turned it into what's basically a community center. It turns out a great acoustics. So we have a wonderful concert coming up next week, week after next, for instance. We do a lot of musical events. We host a lot of dramatic groups. But if you preserve and restore an old building, you want to be able to use it. And we feel the same way about our property, that we feel an obligation to share it with the community. So we're open most years for the Garden Conservancy's open days that people come visit our gardens. Nancy is very involved with the Peconic Land Trust. She's actually the treasurer there now. She's the former board chair. So we've often hosted events for the Peconic Land Trust in our garden. We did last year insects in your garden tour. We've done gardening in the winter. We've done mistakes in our gardens. We've had a lot of different programs for the land trust there, and we've done things for other community groups too. But I think important to share. I've put all this work into it. It's nice to have people come and be able to see what it looks like. We've done house tours. We did an historic Jamesport house tour last year. We've had our house on house tours in the past. So we try to share, try to get people interested, try to get people involved. That's, I think, important.
Yes. And speaking of Peconic Land Trust, you donated the development rights to the remaining...
We did. It's probably a crazy thing to do, but after we'd spent all this money to buy the property, Nancy and I looked at each other and said, well, what can we do to preserve this? Mm-hmm. And that's actually when we were introduced to the Peconic Land Trust. And we ended up donating our development rights. So a lot of people sell them to the town and county, but we decided... We felt very strongly about preservation, so we donated development rights on the farmland and the woodland and the shorefront, by the way. Uh-huh. I mean, and think how valuable that was. And we also put a facade easement on the historic buildings. Mm. And at the time, basically we were giving away our daughter's inheritance. And so, of course, we consulted with them, and they said, go for it. So... So we did. But again, that shows how strongly both of us feel. And I mean, the North Fork is a great place. And we've worked very hard to keep it the way it is. I mean, my involvement with Halleckville, certainly my involvement with the both of our involvements with the Jamesport Meeting House, and Nancy's also been involved in Halleckville. The historic tours we've done in Jamesport, all of the work we've both done for land preservation, and Nancy's been much more active with the land trust than I have. As I mentioned, she was chair for a while and is still the treasurer, but we work actively with the land trust. We were very much involved in the Broad Cove preservation. There's 100 acres of waterfront, former duck farm, beautiful
yes.
farmland. We kayak in there a lot because it's within kayak range of where we live.
I did go on the trail there the other day.
Oh, very good. Well, you see how beautiful it is. Well,
yes.
We were actually the instigators. Well, I shouldn't say we were the only instigator, but we were the one that pushed the Peconic Land Trust over the edge to actually do the deal.
Nice.
And they had to do the same thing. They had to borrow all the money too, and now they're going to be able to sell some of the development rights to the state. But it was a huge lift for the land trust. But we've been very actively involved in that, and a bunch of other. I was involved with preserving Sharper's Hill in Jamesport and turning that into a park. And there's we're talking about 3,000-year-old site
Yes.
that was going to be developed as a shopping center, and they did the archaeological digs and declared there was nothing there, even though it had been professionally archaeologically excavated twice, and the consultants still declared there was nothing of significance. They could dig away half the hill and sell it as fill, basically, and level it and make this shopping and office center, basically. We were both involved with the creation of the North Fork Preserve, for instance, and the county acquisition of that. Nancy actually helped put together the plan for that, working closely with Al Krupski, who was then our favorite county rep. We loved working with him. We also love working with Catherine Stark now. And I was very involved in the creation of Halleck State Park, which, of course, surrounds the Halleckville Museum. I was the one civilian that was on the planning team. I worked with all the Parks Department to actually create the park and figure out what to do with it and so forth. So between our work with the Land Trust and these parks and the museum and I'm chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, so I was able to take the lead in creating 4 very extensive local historic districts. All of downtown Riverhead is now an historic district, for instance, and all of South Jamesport is an historic district, and the Hamlet of Jamesport and Wading River. And we also created 2 National Register historic districts in Riverhead, one on Main Street and one in the area just north of that. I've worked with a bunch of different people in getting their houses on the National Register. We put my brother's farm on the National Register. So between Nancy's work with, and I'm also on the Farmland Preservation Committee in Riverhead. In fact, I've just become co-chair of that, unfortunately. Last thing I need is to be in a leadership position. But, I've been involved in a lot of farmland preservation things through that committee. And then Nancy is on the town's open space committee and has been involved in a lot of open space things. So between the two of us, we've been very involved. And part of it's, you keep on wanting to come back to my family, but I think it's more instinct. When I was in Boston, I was interested in Boston history. I lived in India. I was interested in history of the part of India I lived in. Yes. It's more our I don't know whether it's innate or instinctive or why we both became historians, but the family connections are nice, but I don't think that's where it's at in a way.
Yeah.
It's more the importance everywhere of preserving history, of preserving open space, of preserving nature, of preserving parts of the past that are worth preserving, and there are lots of parts of the past that are not worth preserving.
Yes.
But I think it's important not to take the family connections too seriously.
Yes.
To see more recent immigrants. I mean, my family are immigrants too. It's the same story.
Yes.
And that doesn't make my family of immigrants any more important than a family that came up in the Great Migration from the South in the 1930s, for instance.
Yes. Yes.
Or Hispanic immigrants that are coming today, by the way. I have to add that.
Yes.
They're going to contribute to the community in the same way
that the Polish
Polish did, or the Germans did, or the Irish did, or the African Americans from the South are.
Yes. No, definitely. It's all connected and repeating.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to just ask one or two other questions.
Mm-hmm.
If you could briefly talk about your recent book, A Farm Family on Long Island's North Fork, and why you decided to write this book.
Okay. I mean, in some ways, there's a bit of family history in there. It is the community I grew up in. Mm-hmm. It is the Halleck Museum that I'm on the board of. The farm family were the Hallecks. I do have connections to them. The most recent connection was my grandmother was a cousin of the family living in the homestead. And actually not through the Halleck side, but through the Wells family connection there. So it was what I grew up in. But there's another reason for writing a book like that. And I think this is a more important reason. I remember one of my professors at Brown talking about one of his professors at Harvard, William Elliott Morrison. His first book actually went up in the family attic and found all this material and became one of Harvard's most famous historians. But it gives, when you look at just one family and one little community, you have a different perspective. If you do it well, the local history part isn't the important part. The important part is when you get down to that local level, you can see things. When you're looking with a magnifying glass, a microscope instead of a telescope, you see things from a family perspective that may look very different than when you look at it from a global perspective or a national perspective, which is the way most history is written. So in my mind, that's the reason for writing a book like that. And looking at this little community, the Sound Avenue community, which was unique in some ways because it was actually quite isolated until recently. It was very inbred. It was an unusual community because in the 19th century, most of the book is really about the Halleck family in the 19th and early 20th centuries and the community they lived in. They were all descendants of the original settlers in South Old Town. So they're all the old families. They were all descendants of the Puritan Church. They all went to the same congregational church. They were all related to each other because what happens in these little communities is that's where you find your spouses in that community. And so they were all cousins and second cousins and so forth of each other. Economically, it was a reasonably prosperous farming community, but being an economic historian, I did the numbers, and it turns out that the range was fairly narrow. There weren't any super rich people, and other than the laborers, which don't count, of course, there weren't any real poor people. So they were all within, plus or minus 50% of each other. So they were all reasonably prosperous. Sound Avenue was lined with the first history of Long Island in the 1840s, wherever 1850s, commented on all the beautiful big houses up the length of, it wasn't even called Sound Avenue then, but it was called North Road, but the length of the road. So we have this community, they're all descended from the same people, they're all related to each other, they're all in the same religion, they're all economically the same, and they were all farmers. There was no other occupation in the community except for the minister. And they fought like cats and dogs over everything. Yes. Whatever issue came up, they divided. And, yes. Whether it was a civil war, big things, or whether it was little things like having an organ in the church, There was always this division, and they were suing each other, but that's the country today, isn't it?
Yes.
And
still doing
so
it
you
today.
So the important thing of looking at these things is to pull lessons out of it, to look at what can we learn by looking at the minutiae. The Civil War was this huge thing in the country. So you think, I've got a Halleck diary from 1858, 1859, and we're talking about bloody Kansas and all the rest of it. And what are they concerned about? Temperance. They're going to temperance meetings 2 or 3 times a week because the country is going to hell because they're drinking too much alcohol.
Yes.
And things look, there's that and yet they became ardent supporters of the Civil War. Halsey, who lived to be 101 in the homestead that's now part of the Halleck Museum, his daughter was a music teacher, and she liked so the students would sit with him in the sitting room until they could go in and have their lesson. And he loved telling him about how his first vote for president was for Abraham Lincoln. But what he never told him, and I only found this out doing because you try to look under the covers and find out what's under there, I discovered that he was drafted during the Civil War and didn't go. The town of Riverhead hired a substitute, which all the towns, Southwold did the same thing, by the way. They hired because they were all, the leaders were all Republicans. The Republicans were the radicals then, by the way, the supporters of the war, the supporters of Lincoln. You have to remember that.
Yes.
But in order to keep support, they didn't want their kids going to war. And so the town raised the money. They borrowed the money, took out bonds, and borrowed the money to hire substitutes. And in fact, of the 20, in my research, I think there were 26 young Halleck men in the town of Riverhead that were of age to have gone to war, and only 2 of them did. Most of the rest of them avoided it one way or another, and hiring substitutes. The town hired a substitute for Halsey Halleck, and that substitute was a young German immigrant in New York City. I found the records in the town historian's office. Henry Perkins, famous, it was the town treasurer, went to New York City, paid $500 and hired this substitute, this German substitute named Eric Bartels to fight for, and the substitute went to war and was killed. He was mortally wounded very near Appomattox 2 weeks before the end of the war, and he died. He lingered for a while and died afterwards. So we have this picture of this guy who was very proud of his support for Lincoln, but never talked about the fact that there was a substitute hired for him. I doubt if he knew what happened to the substitute. That was my research to discover that. But actually, the substitute died for him. They never talked about that fact that any of his ancestors were enslavers. He had to have known it. When he was growing up, his grandfather lived in the house. His grandmother, and they both grew up with slaves. But they never ever mentioned that. So to me, doing local history is all about finding these stories they didn't want to talk about, seeing these connections that and it's a very complicated story, but it makes interesting stories too. All the scandals that took place in the community, they tried to shove those under the rug too. But so that's what's at the heart of my book, is these conflicts and these stories, but being able to look at the local level, seeing it from one little family and one little community that was unique in some ways, but humanity in other ways.
Yes. And how can people? Can they get it on Amazon? Or?
Oh, of course, yeah. It's you can. It's available online. It's of course available at the Halleck Museum. My name is a little difficult to search on Amazon, because if you search for Richard Wines, you find lots of wine companies that just happen to have someone named Richard involved with them, or things like that. But search for a farm family on the North Fork, and it will come up. So yes, it should be widely available, and I understand they have it here in the Greenport Library.
Yes, you can check it out here too.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and the work you've done here with. Especially with the Long Island Project, and even
North Fork project.
North Fork project. And even your property with all your historic homes.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to share all of this with you.
Definitely.
And I should add, by the way, my wife's name is Nancy Gilbert. She's very proud of not being a Wines.
All right.
She's a very independent person.
Yes.
So, okay. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 196 with Richard Wines. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.